Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're watching. This is Mike Krupa once again for Votum TV, the Heretics Edition. And today we have a special guest all the way from New York City, Paul Ingrassia, who will be discussing with us today Donald Trump, the intricacies of the upcoming elections in the United States, as well as the future of the America First agenda. Paul, welcome, and how are you doing? We'll be discussing with us today Donald Trump,
Thank you very much, Mike. I very much appreciate the invitation on your broadcast. I'm doing great. It's a dark time for our country right now, as you're well aware. It's a dark time for Western civilization as a whole. For Europe and the United States, we're going through sort of this crisis together. I'm in New York City right now, as you said. Donald Trump is actually making his visit back to the city, as he did last week, for his a circus act of an indictment. So, this is historic times we're living through. And, I look forward to talking to you a little bit about, these issues today.
Excellent. Just for a little bio introduction, Paul is a Claremont Publius and John Marshall Fellow, and he served in President Trump's National Economic Council, graduated from Cornell Law School in 2022, and you can get all his Twitter handle and Substack information in the description box. Make sure to give him a follow and a read. Paul also publishes over at American Greatness, which is a very fairly America First oriented website, which I highly recommend to everybody. So, Paul, just to get the show rolling, we know who the two big heavyweights will most likely be in the Republican contest for the presidential nomination. You have come out obviously very strongly in favor of Donald Trump, but from what I'm seeing, it's not only because of the fact that he was your former boss, but you're actually putting out there strong arguments that Ron DeSantis, or Ron DeSanctimonious, as Donald Trump likes to call him, is not all that he is made out to be. Although a lot of people will take umbrage with that and probably would be surprised. Elaborate, please, with why you think, as of today, Ron DeSantis just doesn't have what it takes to be not only the Republican nominee, but also would make a good president of the United States.
Well, Ron DeSantis obviously has received a lot of the attention, the national spotlight of conservative media since Donald Trump unceremoniously and illegitimately was forced to leave office in 2021. And as a result, there is a vacuum to fill, and Ron DeSantis kind of benefited, I think, a lot from circumstances beyond his control. The fact that we had a lockdown in this country for several years, and a lot of Americans wound up immigrating down to Florida and other conservative states due to the warm weather, the tax benefits, and so forth. So he definitely was sort of in the right place at the right time, I would say. That's not to say that as governor of Florida, he hasn't distinguished himself in certain ways. I think and this is the crux of my criticism for Ron DeSantis. I think he does a very good job of making more of publicity and sort of exploiting, media attention, if you will, in ways that probably supersedes Donald Trump, because I've made the argument that Ron DeSantis has, he relies on publicity stunts such as busing migrants from Florida to Martha's Vineyard, if your viewers may be aware of that, without actually getting any substantive policy done. He uses these high-profile publicity stunts to kind of skirt the issue, not get embroiled in any sort of controversy. So that's one angle to criticize DeSantis. Another angle is, which is the main angle, is that Donald Trump should be our party leader. He should be our president right now. He was denied the presidency by the deep state, by the Biden regime, which Joe Biden is essentially a figurehead for the deep state. And Donald Trump is the one who led America First, who led MAGA, and he was, basically taken out of another term. So I believe he's entitled to another term in office, and I believe Ron DeSantis could wait his turn, much as all the other Republican candidates at this point. The crisis in our country is so grave that Ron DeSantis should be mobilizing his coalition and his political capital, using his bully pulpit to support Donald Trump, because without Donald Trump, there would be no Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis was a failing candidate. He was a no-name politician that was revived, was rescued by a last-minute endorsement from Donald Trump back in 2018 when Ron DeSantis first ran as governor of the state of Florida. Prior to that, he was he was in Congress for several years. He was on the House Freedom Caucus. He wasn't like a high profile congressman, but he was someone who has changed a lot in terms of his ideology and what he's represented. He originally started off as sort of this establishment guy, sort of a war hawk, a neocon type, and then he's tried to transform himself into this populist MAGA Trump type candidate. But he's done so, I think, disingenuously. He's done so insincerely, and I don't think even he realizes that this is something that's beyond him. That he's trying to make himself out to be something that he's not. And now we're hearing reports that he may not even run. So there's a lot that I just kind of explained to you there. We could kind of go into each issue in more granular detail, but from the way I see it, Ron DeSantis is more of the same political establishment. He's basically George Bush or Jeb Bush 2.0. And for that reason, and for the other reasons I mentioned, he should not be our party frontrunner.
A lot of hardcore MAGA types are obviously saying that, we had Trump for 4 years. I think Ann Coulter would be the prime example here. He didn't shut down immigration. He didn't build a wall. It's time to move on. There's other guys on Twitter like that Bill Mitchell guy, apparently. A lot of people turning away from...
Shill Mitchell is what we call him.
Nice. Good to know. So a lot of them are throwing these arguments out there. But even from I think a PR perspective, I think you watch the entire dynamic fairly closely, you can pretty much tell that, DeSantis, whether he likes it or not, is not really the red meat MAGA guy that Trump is. Whatever Trump accomplished or not in the White House, but a guy who comes from the Freedom Caucus, worked at Guantanamo at one point, who basically, I think if you look at his record when he was still in Congress, was a pretty fairly conventional hawkish type Republican. And the fact that he made some sensible comments in response to Tucker Carlson's questionnaire that was sent out a few weeks ago on the Ukraine war, which actually surprised me, considering the people that were lining up to support him from the establishment Republican machine. And, a few days later, he does a 180 in a way. And he says, yeah, but Putin is a thug. And he basically regurgitates all the neocon talking points. Whereas Trump doubles down and says, Russia and China aren't the threat to Western civilization. America, the people that rule America are the greatest threat. So on a rhetorical level, that difference is definitely there. And I want to ask you about, should an eye-opening factor in all this be the people that are slowly, at least, or in media statements, are lining up behind DeSantis? People like the former governor of Florida, Bush, Karl Rove type people. Shouldn't that be an eye-opener to a lot of people who are looking at the Republican field in terms of, with this guy, we might have the establishment coming back to the fore. With Trump, it's always unpredictable, but at least we know he has his own instincts that are fairly more conservative and more non-interventionist than what DeSantis represents.
Right. I mean, there are several points there. Number one is, yes, Ron DeSantis is not a self-made businessman like Donald Trump. Part of the reason why, or a large part of the reason why Donald Trump has been so effective in terms of what he's done and why he's been deemed like the enemy of our regime. No one else has received the amount of criticisms that Donald Trump has, and no one can possibly get to that level of criticism, facing 3 indictments, in the states of New York, Georgia, and DC, and all the rest of the controversy that surrounds him from the standpoint of, our regime, is because Donald Trump is not dependent on, the corporate interests, the special interests, the global interests, which cannot be said about Ron DeSantis. Not only does DeSantis have the backing of the sort of the conventional Republican establishment, the Karl Rove types, the Paul Ryan types. I'm sure Mitt Romney would eventually support him. The McCain family has voiced positive things to say about Ron DeSantis, and of course the Bush family. Some people forget that Jeb Bush was governor of Florida for many years, and Ron DeSantis sort of inherited that legacy of the Bush family, the Bush dynasty, that has made significant inroads in the state of Florida. The state legislature is very much of the Bush ideological sort of bent, and Ron DeSantis, in many ways, is a creature of that environment. Jeb Bush was recently on Fox News doing part of a Ron DeSantis special, in which DeSantis was interviewed by Brian Kilmeade. And, Bush had many positive things to say about Ron DeSantis because he obviously sees Ron DeSantis as sort of this empty vessel type politician in which he could kind of sneak or the Bush family, the Bush type, the Bush reversion of neoconservatism policies. They see DeSantis as the perfect vessel to sneak those policies in. As far as who's endorsing Ron DeSantis, you have the Libertarian Club for Growth, which is very much an open borders, anti-Chinese tariff organization that has donated, I believe, millions of dollars to Ron DeSantis. His largest donor, who's donated several $1 million to Ron DeSantis, is Ken Griffin, who has significant financial ties to China, and I'm sure would be goading Ron DeSantis, a would-be Ron DeSantis presidency, into something like what we're seeing right now in the Ukraine. I'm sure they're egging on something like that in Taiwan, a sort of ground war type scenario. So, those are very worrying from the standpoint of someone who supports an American first agenda, who supports the non-interventionism of Donald Trump. And then there's also sort of the practical side of things. Could you imagine Ron DeSantis trying to negotiate with, President Xi of China, or President Kim Jong-un, or Vladimir Putin? I mean, Ron DeSantis is not that type of person. He won his next election for governor. He won this past year in 2022 by a significant margin, but he didn't do too well in the debate stage against Charlie Crist, who's really this milquetoast, sort of conventional. I mean, he was a Republican, and now he changed parties. And, that guy really out debated Ron DeSantis on the stage. DeSantis is really not someone who has a lot of charisma or a lot of personality. He doesn't connect well with audiences. I just recently saw him on Long Island in New York do an event with our former Congressman Lee Zeldin, who ran for governor this past year. And DeSantis was not connecting well with the audience at all. I would say about 40% left before the event even ended, and there was only about 200 or 300 people there, and they were all wearing Trump shirts and Trump paraphernalia, and most of them said that they would support Trump over DeSantis. But just from that standpoint, DeSantis does not do well in terms of, obviously he doesn't have Donald Trump's penchant for publicity and for connecting with working class everyday Americans. Number one, and number two, he's a weak guy. He can't negotiate. He can't, even the people he's surrounded by are like a bunch of clowns on Twitter. But you mentioned Bill Mitchell before. There are a lot of other names. I won't go into all of them right now here, but these are not high quality people. A lot of people make the criticism against Trump that he didn't have the best personnel around him. But if you're looking at the people who are supporting Ron DeSantis right now, they make the Trump people, even the bad Trump people, look pretty good by comparison. So, so Ron DeSantis on many fronts is not, this non-interventionist type of person. I think you made the remarks before that, you know, he seems to be changing a little bit. He's trying to pivot towards more of a American first stance on the Ukraine conflict, specifically, which I would criticize. I would dispute. I wrote an article on this, arguing that Ron DeSantis is not really a true, authentic non-interventionist. A lot of the lines he used to describe his policy against the Ukraine seemed like they were written by DC consultants. One of the big red flags that stood out to me was his saying that I will not sign over a blank check to Zelensky. But if you look at the statements from known neoconservatives like Mike Pompeo or Mitch McConnell, everyone has used that language. I mean, if you say you're not going to sign over a blank check to the Ukraine, that's effectively a meaningless phrase. I mean, yeah, you're not going to send $20 trillion over to the Ukraine. I mean, that there's no limiting principle in that statement. I mean, even Joe Biden himself said he would not, send over a blank check or send ground troops over to the Ukraine. Another statement that Ron DeSantis said. So nothing of what he says I take sincerely. I don't think he's genuinely someone that we could trust on this issue, or genuinely has a non-interventionist approach at heart in terms of the Ukraine. And even if he did, even if he was totally on board with Donald Trump on that issue, again, the problem with negotiating with Putin, as well as being exploited by opportunistic actors within his executive branch, people who are more loyal to Lockheed Martin and to Raytheon over the American people, I worry about, because I don't think he lacks the competence, or he possesses the competency to truly drain the swamp and to get the best people aligned with him. So those are some of the concerns I have about Ron DeSantis on that issue.
In an excellent piece, which I encourage everyone to read over at And Greatness, titled Trump Should Fight Fire with Fire, you make the following statement, I quote, "Trump's true power, which is the unspoken source of authority in a mass democracy, is his unrivaled ability to choreograph narratives that make him and his policies an attention-grabbing spectacle. That source of authority, excuse me, which might be classified as extra-legal or extra-constitutional in the end, commands greater power than conventional legal mechanisms, which merely verbalize and incubate values born of state propaganda." End quote. Well, I don't know if you've ever read him, but that was a very Carl Schmitt type argument right there, which I applaud, by the way, because I think Schmitt was a great thinker. But it's a powerful piece.
Right.
There you go. You just unmasked yourself.
Yeah, I plead guilty to that.
It's a very powerful statement, but I would agree with you that it does go a long way, because one of the things that I observed in 2015 and 2016 were people in Poland here, and I was watching every Trump rally, and my wife can testify to that. I mean, I was everywhere via the YouTube. I was really observing closely the presidential campaign, and one of the things I noticed was, you got packed stadiums, and you have please clap. You have packed stadiums, and you have Hillary Clinton with her small groups of people around. It's just, in terms of numbers, this guy had to win. And when I'm seeing what's happening right now in New York, how he was being, welcomed and applauded, and how he comes back to Mar-a-Lago and the people line the roads and the streets, and it's just a huge love fest for him. Now, I can't really verify how much the numbers have changed in 2016, 2020, and right now, but in terms of just, the objective showing of receptions for this guy, he still got it. He still got it, so to say. So I think that goes a long way, and definitely DeSantis doesn't have it. You can compare DeSantis to a guy who tries to be more of an intellectual, and somebody tells him, but you got to be MAGA sometimes. But no, I still feel more of an intellectual milquetoast guy, whereas Trump is just the red meat MAGA stuff. But here's the fundamental question. I know a lot of people who will be watching this recording will be asking, and not only Americans, but a lot of Poles who sympathize with Trump and saw the 4 years, the way he governed, the people he surrounded himself with. You were in the White House. You saw some of these things up close. I think one of the fundamental questions right now will be, what guarantees do we, people over the world, especially Americans, have that this time around, should he win, Donald Trump won't, for example, nominate a John Bolton for a national security advisor, or won't nominate, Gary Cohn type people or Mike Pompeo type people? Your thoughts, Paul?
I think it's a fair question, and to that I respond with, Donald Trump. People tend to forget that he walked into this situation really just like the rest of us. We didn't know what we were getting into. We didn't know how bad, how corrupt, how deep, the level of corruption was in Washington D.C. And I think Trump walked into that. Thinking that after 2016, he might be able to unify the country. He might be able to work with those who were plotting against him in the primaries, and work on and be a collaborator. I mean, he comes from New York City. He had only ever visited DC, I think, like a dozen times in his prior 70 years prior to originally getting into office in 2016. So he came from a practical, pragmatic sort of mindset. He's worked with people of all ideological stripes throughout his real estate career. So, and people have liked him. I mean, he's a very agreeable personality, and people tend to like him. So I think he kind of had that expectation going into DC. And obviously that turned out not to be the case. So I think Donald Trump, certainly more than anyone, has learned just how bad the corruption is, and he's become wiser as a result of that. I think his personnel actually got a lot better. I think and throughout the 4 years of his term in office, there's something as well. There's also the point to be made that there really wasn't much personnel quality people to choose from in the first place. I mean, he basically did this campaign on his own budget. He was sort of a ragtag group. He wasn't relying on the professional class. And once he only had a few months to assemble his administration, and he had to rely on a lot of these people because frankly, there wasn't a lot of talent to go around. And then once you have those people in there, over time, you get to see actually how the process works, who's a bad person, who will remain loyal. And even to this day, you're seeing people, break away from him or remaining loyal. So this whole process had to play out before you got to a point where you could fully assess the entire situation and realize, like, these are the types of people I could confidently trust and rely upon, and these aren't. And I think that process had to play out because this political movement that Trump spearheaded is so unique. It's so unprecedented in our history, and certainly in our modern history. He took a direct challenge to the deep state, to the Washington establishment, in a way that no other politician has ever done. So people have to just be mindful of that and remember just how historic his movement was, and trust that he's learned from this process, as we all have. All of our eyes have been open. No one back in 2016 would have guessed just how bad the situation would get by 2023, with the deep state persecuting a former president of the United States. So, and to the point about DeSantis now, I mean, you built up this infrastructure in Donald Trump. You built up this movement. Why would you want to dismantle that and start from the ground up, start all over again with an untested personality who has already shown himself to be very much malleable and very much could be exploited by the same people who are the enemies of the movement? So, I think people have to stand by Donald Trump. I think they have to trust Donald Trump. I think he has better instincts than anyone. And I think he continues to prove that in his speeches and his policy statements, and really everything that he's done on behalf of the American people. He's sacrificed so much for this country. And on that reason alone, we should be behind this guy. I mean, no one has had to deal with this amount of stress, this amount. I mean, no one could have dealt with that amount of stress without totally imploding. Donald Trump is someone he's the greatest man of our generation, and he became president because of that fact. He is the only man who could go through all of this, and he's battle tested, and he's someone that we just have to put our trust in, and he's going to have a very good administration the second time around. The real issue that we should be focusing on is getting him back into the White House and the obstacles that we have to overcome to get him there in terms of the outstanding issues regarding election fraud, election corruption, and everything else like that. So, I would not worry about personnel. I don't think it's a criticism that at this point really has much, is significant. I mean, there are still issues with people. There will always be bad eggs. There will always be bad apples who are disloyal and plotting behind the scenes. But ultimately, the cream will rise to the top. And I think Trump's next administration would be definitely a scorched earth sort of retribution type of administration. I don't think he's going to hold back on his political enemies.
And I think Shanker agrees with us. He wrote, "No point comparing DeSantis with Trump. The U.S. needs someone to clean up Biden's mess. And Trump's the man. If DeSantis is a good leader, he should be kept as a reserve to rebuild after Trump's term." So basically, let's keep Ron in Tallahassee and maybe he'll learn. Paul, what do you make of I've heard this sort of mini conspiracy theory whereby the Democrats actually want Trump to run. That's why this whole Bragg situation with the indictments and so on, because they're confident that any Democratic candidate, and taking into consideration that a majority of Democrats don't want Biden to run, but even if Biden were to run again, that they will have no problem with beating Trump. What do you think of that theory that's floating around?
It's totally stupid. It's out of touch with reality. I mean, there's no basis for it. Just even looking at the polls, which, I don't put that much, I don't attach that much weight to these polls or value to these polls. But I mean, Donald Trump is the best candidate Republicans have by every single poll that comes out, and by a mile. So the people who actually, I don't know if who is saying that, whether it's coming more from the left or the right, meaning the DeSantis people. But the bottom line is Donald Trump, he beat Joe Biden in 2020. That was an illegitimate election, and he will do so again in 2024. So I don't place really any value to that argument. I think it's a dumb argument, and the people who are making that argument need to get their heads checked. I see it a lot from some liberal newspapers and press. One thing I will say is, we've been kind of attaching George Soros to Ron DeSantis, and that's because George Soros made some remarks about a month or two ago in which he said that, he said that something like Ron DeSantis, I don't know if he used the term respectable, but he said, Ron DeSantis is someone that, is a worthy opponent, whereas Donald Trump is someone that we have to completely disregard. And he was totally disgusted, no positive things to say about that. And in those remarks, I think those are quite revealing, because they demonstrate to us that the left, the globalists, the fact that they have nothing positive to say about Donald Trump shows how much of a threat he is in their eyes still to this day. I mean, he is considered, he's considered a wrecking ball. He's considered the one true force of nature that could smash the political establishment, the uni party, as we call it. And he's the only one capable of doing that. So that's why sort of some of us were calling Ron DeSantis Ron DeSoros, because of that affiliation. But I think the bigger point is that Donald Trump is still considered the greatest threat to the system, and no one else has come along to even rival, what Donald Trump could bring to the table.
In terms of the Soros factor, I think he's a good criteria for a lot of people. Basically, whoever George Soros hates, you have to suspect is doing something right. So Viktor Orban, for example. I mean, on the target list right there. I believe that Viktor Orban and Trump are friends. Actually, I've noticed that there was an article I think today in the Washington Post whereby, according to some of those leaks that came out in the recent days from the Pentagon, most of them having to do with Ukraine, obviously, but some pretended to claim that Orban was making private claims that their number one enemy currently of Hungary is the United States government, and we have to stop the meddling. So, this is a formal NATO ally and formal ally of the United States. So we've seen how far things have gone in that regard. In terms of the other side, we've also had an interesting development, and I'm really curious as to how this will play out because with all my reservations to the persona of Roger Stone and his shenanigans sometimes, but he has some interesting points to make, and he's obviously a very talented and experienced political animal. He made this statement, I think it was on a podcast a few days ago, that, or he hinted that we might see a dream ticket of Donald Trump and Bobby Kennedy Jr. at some point. Looking at the reaction of the Democrats and the left, who are just, going at it against RFK, saying he's a clown, a kook because of his stance on vaccinations. But not only that, obviously, he's come out against the interventionist foreign policy, the neocons, the globalists. That would indeed make for an interesting ticket. And, some people will say that's science fiction. But I mean, in 2015, in June, when you looked at the escalator saying this is science fiction, this guy's going nowhere, right? Mm-hmm. What are the limits of possible political exotic coalitions in the United States currently? Because it seems we're pushing the envelope, and what seems crazy today might not seem so crazy in a few months or in a year, for example. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think anything is crazy anymore. I think sort of that whole outlook has been shattered forever. I think it's just a matter of more and more people waking up to that reality. I like Roger Stone a lot. I speak with him pretty frequently, and I did see that podcast with his. I'm good friends with a lot of the people on that show, and he and Laura Loomer have been doing great work together, exposing Ron DeSantis. But as far as like an RFK Trump ticket, I think it is still probably a long shot. I don't know if that's something that will come about, but it's getting increasingly difficult especially it's difficult as a Republican to run against the establishment, as demonstrated by Donald Trump and the relative lack of institutional support from the RNC and from Washington on his behalf. I mean, they're still fighting against him, every single day. But if you run sort of against the establishment as a Democrat, the example of Bernie Sanders and what they did to him in both 2016 and 2020 shows that it's even more difficult to run as an outsider. And Bernie's not really that much of an outsider, to tell you the truth. I mean, he seemed more like an outsider in 2016 running as a socialist, but in reality, a lot of his policies are lockstep with the Biden regime and neoliberalism and so forth. So RFK, on the other hand, especially with his vaccination stance and his stance against, the military industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, the globalist American empire, that puts him definitely at a distance, at odds with his party establishment. I think even beyond that someone like Tulsi Gabbard offered, and she was obviously bullied out of the party in 2020. She obviously had to leave the party as a result. So I don't see the Democrats giving him a platform. The fact that he has probably some money behind him would give him some sort of an advantage. But I think, I think they're looking that they would definitely not accept him as a candidate at all. So what does that mean? That means he would have to either run as a Republican or as an independent. Mm-hmm. Now, there are a lot of issues with RFK in terms of his stance on global warming and the climate agenda. And I'm sure he has pretty liberal positions on LGBT rights and all those types of issues, immigration as well. So I don't know if he would make the ideal choice for Trump to pick as VP, although at this point, anything could go. I mean, you don't have too many options really for that VP choice. I think it's an interesting story. It's an interesting development. I don't like speculating that much on like who's going to be Trump's VP. I don't think it's as important as a lot of people make it out to be. Although, as we did see with 2020 with Mike Pence's betrayal, the VP, obviously, if he or she is disloyal to the president, that could have significant repercussions for the country at large. So it is a very important role. We should not understate it. But in terms of speculating, I don't do too much of that. RFK, I like his positions. At the very least, the bare minimum, he could help move some people on his party to a more skeptical outlook on the vaccines and the lockdowns and the deep state. And he's been very good. He really has been one of the best on this issue, to his credit, over the last, he's been doing this for a while now, but really over the last 2 or 3 years, he's been phenomenal on this issue. And he's reasonable. He's someone you could talk to. He's not going to shout you down. And he's obviously he has the Kennedy name behind him, and there's a lot with that legacy. The fact that it's personal for him, the fact that RFK and his uncle JFK were ousted likely by, some combination of the CIA, the deep state, all the rest. I won't go into that. Your viewers definitely should follow Roger Stone and read his books on that, because he's probably the best authority on that subject. But, it'd be interesting to see sort of an RFK campaign and what he does. But I think the likelihood of a Trump RFK ticket is not that high. But again, I agree with you, Mike. I would not write off anything at this point, and I don't think people should.
Well, we know who we can write off, because you mentioned that the office of VP is mostly symbolic. But I'm reminded of a quote from that great movie, Vice, where Christian Bale plays Dick Cheney, and he says in that graveling voice, vice presidency is mostly a symbolic job. However, and he makes all those claims. Dick Cheney is still around. We know Donald Trump's not going to pick him, but it's just, I'm saying, some people actually understand how they can manipulate the process in order to get things done. But yeah, total agreement. I don't think we should be expecting, at least from all the hardcore messaging that's coming out of Mar-a-Lago right now, that he's going to be looking for anybody at least in the same league as Mike Pence in 2016. So yeah, I agree. I have the same instincts and feeling that it could go in a more, I wouldn't say wild, but a more unexpected or exotic direction. And Roger Stone has been right on several issues. I actually remember an email I sent him a month before Trump announced proposing an interview on a totally different subject, and all of a sudden Trump announces, and he's working for him for some time in the campaign. So who knows? He has been a prophet for some time now. In terms of the indictment and the whole brag show that's going on, for our international audience, is there any way that this legal or this manipulation of the law that's taking place right now can be used in any way to prevent Trump from running, or is that totally out of the question right now?
Well, I think they hope so. I think, they call him Teflon Donnie, and he's escaped, everything over the past, everything they've thrown at him since he descended the escalator in June of 2015. It's amazing. We're almost a decade from that fateful day. But he's managed to escape all their attacks, whether it was the Mueller investigation that really took up so much of his administration and took up so much oxygen out of the room, both impeachments. We know the whole story at this point. So of course, now that he's formally declared, he declared at Mar-a-Lago back in November. Now they're trying to derail his campaign using this sort of legal process. Obviously, this is a baseless case. This was something that had been the facts of this case, the hush money payment for Stormy Daniels and for another porn star. This has been sort of circulating since at least 2018. No one at the federal level, the DOJ, wanted to investigate this or get Trump on this. They saw the charges as being, or the fact pattern and the connection there being far too outrageous, far too attenuate, too much of a long shot to get him on that. So they punted on it, and Bragg himself even was reluctant to go through with this particular charge. It wasn't until one of his attorneys who worked at the office, a radical left-wing attorney, left his office and sort of rallied public support, or rallied sort of this campaign to put pressure on Bragg to follow through on this charge, as well as other influences working on Bragg's office. Definitely Merrick Garland is behind this. Definitely the Biden regime as a whole is behind this. I'm sure dark money interests, George Soros, these types of people are all putting pressure on Bragg. Bragg is kind of just like the useful idiot, the facade for this claim. Bragg's an idiot too. He's not an intelligent guy. I mean, he graduated from Harvard Law School, but he could barely string, a sentence together, and he's disgustingly fat. He's not a credible authority. But the bottom line is the people behind him, backing him and wanting to bring down Donald Trump, definitely see this as some way to do so. I don't know how this will play out. I really don't have a definitive answer for you. I mean, the fact that they're coordinating along with, what they're doing right now in Georgia as well as DC, the Georgia cases regarding Trump's alleged interference in the 2020 election, and the DC case is the January 6th case. They're throwing everything at the wall, and they're trying to bring him down. Using everything they got. Every single claim is baseless and meritless and wouldn't hold up in a normal justice system that upheld the Constitution and rule of law. The problem is the people in charge of the justice system today are radical, rogue, left-wing activists who see it as their mission to destroy the opponent, destroy Donald Trump. So if that is their end goal, I mean, they're trying everything that they possibly can to bring him down. And it just is a matter of whether Trump could mobilize enough support, and whether the Republican Party and his base could actively support him and do another repeat of 2016. It's a very difficult situation. It's a very tragic situation, I think, in our country's history. And I think if our country is to have a future, it will be determinative. It will be based on whether Trump could prevail in the face of these accusations against him. Now, I wrote that article saying that Trump should mobilize his platform, his media presence. I mean, Trump still could command the media like no one else. I was down here at Trump Tower last Monday when he made his homecoming, and they had helicopters all over the place. Parts of Fifth Avenue were closed down, barricades across, blocking off Trump Tower. There was more press there. I spoke to someone in the press who had been covering Trump for 40 years, and he said, this is the most amount of press and publicity I've seen in my career, and I've been covering Trump for 40 years. I've been covering him throughout his entire public life. So the fact that he could create a spectacle, and we should not underestimate the power of that. I mean, he cost New York State $200 million just to bring him down from Trump Tower down to the courthouse. So Trump should exploit that. That there's a lot of power in that, and this is the American law. I also wrote American law. It's not based on substance. It's based on process, and Trump has to be able to outdo what they're trying to do to him. They're trying to basically use process to prolong this whole thing, delay it, have him come back and forth from Mar-a-Lago to New York, and just drain him of his money, his resources, and his time. Trump has to try to play offense on that. And, last week he drained the state of $200 million of resources. He should do that every single time. He should try to find ways to make it difficult for them to play this game, because obviously they're out for blood. And the Republicans, Donald Trump, has to realize that and have to recognize what time it is, and that you mentioned Schmidt before. This is sort of, our politics are divided on friend-enemy lines, and Donald Trump knows who his enemies are, and his enemies know what their mission is. That they want to bring him down, and they're doing a form of retribution justice, and that's what Donald Trump has to do in return. So, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But I don't think there's any stopping Donald Trump. I'm optimistic about that.
Are you aware? Obviously, you can't divulge any top secrets from Mar-a-Lago. I'm not asking you to, but are you aware of any active shadow cabinet that's forming around Donald Trump in terms of potential people that might serve in cabinet positions? Or are we still talking like 2016, basically, where you had a loose confederation of very different think tanks, journals, and so on, people who would go on, for example, like Michael Anton, to serve in an official capacity in the White House? Or is this still, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing because we did mention the charisma, but is it still a one-man show, or is there a quasi-organization of shadow functionaries in the future administration gathering around Donald Trump?
There are a lot of organizations that have come up since Trump took office and since Trump departed DC as well, that are trying to sort of do this, what you spoke about, forming a cabinet or an administrative in waiting to get quality personnel in line and in check, so that the next Trump administration could be up and running. I have a lot of friends. I'm friends with a lot of these people. I'm not extremely optimistic that that's the best agenda. I don't know if you could plan something. I mean, you get high quality people and loyalists and get a general sense of how people stand on Donald Trump, especially now, given all that he's going through and given how much, people put on the line just by defending him, is a major sacrifice in doing so. So, I would say to you that the people who will likely be in his next administration are those who are most loyal to him right now. And you know who those names are. They are the loudest and most active and advocates for Donald Trump. The people who are putting everything on the line now when it's becoming increasingly difficult to support Donald Trump, I think those are the types of people who will be in his next administration. I mean, there is a more formal operation going on, and there are a lot of people involved in that. But I think the greatest telltale of who will be in the next administration are those right now saying supporting Donald Trump openly, and it shouldn't be too hard to find who those people are. So, I mean, for your viewers, if they're wondering who those people might be, go on Twitter, read the news, and see who those voices are now supporting Donald Trump. You could probably you can name a lot of them on one or two hands, but that's just the nature of what this movement is. It's one man against the political establishment, the political Leviathan. He represents the American people, and the bottom line is he would be well advised to choose those who are most loyal to him now, and he recognizes that. He knows that. I mean, he almost hired Laura Loomer last Friday. This kind of got derailed a little bit, but that's something that I think I'm optimistic that those types will ultimately be the ones who who Trump will surround himself with, or not just Laura, but there are many people who are standing by Donald Trump now, and I think you're going to see sort of those types make up his next administration.
Well, if you don't make chief of staff in the next White House, I hope you'll make future ambassador to Poland. I mean, we need a good American ambassador here because we've just had.
We need a good one to the Vatican too. I mean, we need a MAGA type ambassador in the Vatican helping reform the church. I mean, that would be. I don't know if that's the role that if I worked for the next administration, if that's a role I would take up, but I would like to see someone in there protecting traditional Catholics. And I think you're going to have to use some sort of, you would have to have that type of political power that political authority to make reforms to the church, because the church is not going to reform itself at this point. But I know that's a bit of a digression.
No, it's a very good digression, because it's a parallel situation. If we're talking in philosophical terms here, I think it was Thomas Molnar who once wrote that we will know. I'm not quoting directly here, but he said we will know that the end of the world is coming when the United States and the Catholic Church have succumbed to the revolution.
Yeah.
So I think we're coming up on the end of the world slowly.
I spoke to you before the camera that the deep state and the deep church go hand in hand, and the corruption in Washington is catastrophic. But compared to the corruption within the church itself, I think it's even worse. So the two, I agree 100%. I mean, I'm a devout Catholic, and I obviously see the crisis in the church in tandem with the crisis of what's going on, not just in the United States, but really all throughout the world at this point. So I agree completely with that. And I think, if there is going to be hope for the future, we're going to have to reform both. You can't have a weak church. You're not going to have a strong country without a weak church, which provides the moral bedrock for everything else, for culture, for politics, for economics, for everything. So that's like the baseline problem. And a lot of our political issues run downstream of that more fundamental issue.
Amen to that. We have a question from one of our viewers. Shanker says, a philosophical question for both Mike and Paul. It seems the two-party system is responsible for most of Trump's and American people's woes. If Trump wins in 2024, do you think he will do something about it? And Paul, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I think he has to do something about it. It'll be interesting to see how this primary plays out. If for some unfathomable reason he's not the Republican Party nominee, I think we'll see if he should definitely take action against the Republican Party establishment. I don't know what that will look like, but I think I think his base is with him. They're not loyal to the Republican Party. They're loyal to him and him alone. And I think he needs to get the RNC needs to get on board with him. This is an organization that is squandering resources, not making the best. It's certainly totally inefficient, and it's aligned with the Republican establishment against Donald Trump still to this day, even though Ronna McDaniel has said some nice things about Trump and vice versa. But the institutions themselves have to be totally gutted, totally brought to the ground, totally defunded. And this is going to be a monumental task for Donald Trump. And it's one that probably won't be accomplished within a 4-year time period, but we could hope at least to make some progress within that next 4 years. And I think he realizes how urgent the situation is, and I think he's going to do everything he possibly can to correct this suicidal trajectory we're going on as a country. I mean, it's hard to sort of recall that just 3 years ago. I mean, right now we seem like we're on the verge of World War III going on with what's going on in the Ukraine and Russia, the Middle East, and China. But we had pretty much a very peaceful presidency. I mean, one of Donald Trump's greatest accomplishments, I think, as president was the amount of global stability that he ushered in as a result of his diplomacy and as a result of his administration's philosophy on the global stage. I mean, he called out NATO. He said this is basically a defunct organization, a relic of the Cold War. He got people to pay, especially Europe. We get ripped off by these countries, and he got them to pay their what they owe us. The fact that he shook hands with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. I mean, that's monumental. That's historic. The fact that he was able to get that done. I mean, I remember Trump saying that when he had that one meeting with Obama, as soon as he won in 2016 in November, he went down to the White House, met with Obama, and Obama said, this North Korea thing is going to be a major crisis. This is going to probably be your most difficult issue. And Trump was able to get Rocket Man to stop launching his missiles and form a friendship with him. And that was something that was unforeseen. That was something that we could not have even imagined. Although I have trust in Donald Trump, and I know that's something that, obviously he would be able to pull off. But no one else could do that. No one else has that talent and that ability to negotiate the art of the deal on the international stage like him. And because of that, now the world is sort of in crisis. And at this point, there is no world leader. I mean, we talked about Orban before, but he's still in charge of a small country, relatively speaking, and it's still dependent a lot on NATO and basically the American empire as a whole. So really, I think that sort of leadership ultimately has to come from the United States. Otherwise, you're going to get someone like China filling the void, which they have been doing, and they're basically, they're running riots around the global order. They're basically, I mean, the United States feels like at this point almost like a Chinese colony, given how much influence China has in terms of buying up real estate, in terms of occupying our best institutions. I mean, I went to Cornell and like 50% of the class was Chinese foreigners. So, and that's the case in every Ivy League school. That's the case really now in major industries across the board. So we have serious issues here, and Donald Trump is probably the only one who could resolve them and do so in a timely fashion. I mean, he was able to pull this off, within several months of his first term in office. So, I'm confident he could do it again, but I think the stakes are just even higher this time around. And he knows that as well. And I think the American people clearly see it that way too.
I think one of the distinguishing features of Trump currently, but when he was at the White House at the same time, is because, and it's a subtle difference if you look at it, because, if you watch Fox News, you read, listen to Mark Levin, and everybody's talking about the CCP, China threat CCP. But I'm convinced, and a lot of people who did work, at least in the latter half, like Doug McGregor for the administration, would say that Trump doesn't want a war with China. He wants to sort out a lot of the economic issues that are with China. That obviously began with how Wall Street sold out Middle America. I mean, the initiative came from obviously a few streets next to where you are right now.
Right.
But that distinction, I think, is crucial because a lot of people have found religion on China in the sense that, Eldridge Colby, I believe his name is, he said, we shouldn't be concentrating on Russia. Russia is not the threat. China is the threat. But they don't make that distinction that, hey, wait a minute, we're not advocating for kinetic action here.
Right.
I mean, China is a power and will remain a power.
Right.
Economic issues, we're a competitor for sure. But I think Trump did make that crucial distinction. I mean, if you look at his meetings with Xi Jinping and what he's saying right now, what was it, 2 days ago, he said that the smartest people on earth right now are Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping. So he has respect for these guys, which is a fundamental starting point if you want to talk about any sort of diplomatic breakthrough. Whereas everybody else is just, CCP, evil Chinese, and so on. They want to take over the world. So when I hear that Trump, is an idiot, he has no idea about foreign affairs. I mean, no, he's making a very crucial distinction in this regard. He's moving away from the war camp. He's sort of being very Nixonian in that regard, that China is a great power, but going to war with China would be suicide, it'd be idiocy. Let's compete. We have things that we have to take care of with them. The same with Russia. But I mean, he, in essence, is not succumbing to that, I would say, forever Cold War, forever anti-communist mentality that a lot of the neocons have become in the last couple of years. Whereas, it was always cool to be against Iraq, Iran. Right. Now, the cool thing is to be against China. But Trump does make that distinction. It's a different ballgame with him. Or would you agree with me that he's making that distinction?
It's an excellent point, Mike. Now, I'm sorry I keep drinking water through here. It's 90 degrees in New York today, so it's like the hottest day ever, and we don't have AC yet in this.
I got another cup with me right here, so I got to drink also.
So your viewers know, it's like a scorching day in New York. Trump brought the Florida weather with him.
Amen.
But I will say, I think this is an extremely important point because Donald Trump, first of all, he was the first politician to really call out China when he got into office. He was the first president to take a really tough stance on China. Now, unfortunately, that tough stance towards China, since Trump has left office, has been manipulated by the neocons into a form of toughness that is not the type of toughness that Donald Trump represented. Donald Trump was tough in terms of leveling tariffs against China, getting our industries back here at home. He fought an economic war, and he fought it through economic means and through diplomacy. Whereas the DC blob, the DC military industrial complex, is instead interpreting toughness on China to be what they always do in terms of waging like a land war with China to protect whether it's Taiwan or Hong Kong, whatever, instigating sort of either a soft color revolution type ordeal or to actually instigate full on a conflict with China. And that's the only way they understand the world. That's in those terms. That's the only way they can understand the world. Whereas Donald Trump came from it from the standpoint of a negotiator and a diplomat, a true, genuine statesman. And under him, there would never be any sort of actual military conflicts with China. I mean, he would recognize that as being insane. Meanwhile, DC thinks tough on China means, military conflict with China, and still let China buy up all of our real estate. I mean, China basically owns all these buildings outside my apartment, buy up all the land, continue to build, these biolabs. I mean, the state of Florida alone, just under Ron DeSantis, I think China just opened up a biolab in October of last year. So for the guy who makes himself out to be tough on COVID, I mean, he's clearly not tough on the real issues that matter. The fact that China is building a biolab for gain-of-function research in the state of Florida, which I wrote about. People could see that on my Substack and my articles I've written on American greatness. I mean, meanwhile, DeSantis says he's tough on China because he's the tough guy who would instigate war with Xi Jinping to please his donor and Ken Griffin. So there's a fundamental distinction in being tough on China, which you hit on, and which I wish more Americans would recognize. Most people who are tough on China, you should be skeptical towards that. I mean, Joe Biden is tough on China for what it's worth.
Especially his son. His son is very tough on China.
That's right, absolutely. So I think that's a very great point that you bring up, and there's definitely a distinction between Trump and the rest of them.
Amen to that, and we'll hope to see that play out in the next few months during the debates and hopefully during the very dynamic and exciting presidential campaign. Paul, this was a wonderful discussion. Thank you once again for your time. I think I speak for all the audience when I say we hope to see you again as the campaign unwinds, and I hope the weather is a little bit cooler in New York in the next few hours and days. Happy Easter octave for what we have left in these days after the resurrection of our Lord, and hope to see you soon. God bless, and thank you once again for your time with me and our audience. This is Paul Ingrassia, who you can check out on Twitter and Substack and over at American Greatness. Make sure to give him a follow, and obviously subscribe to Vote in TV for our email list for getting all the updates, and hope to see you soon on our program. Take care, everybody.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks a lot.